I'm Karen Friedman Agnifilo. This is Danya Perry joining me tonight on this special episode of Legal AF. So much going on. Danya was in the courtroom today with Donald Trump testifying in the New York Attorney General civil fraud case. Don't forget, Danya represents Michael Cohen. Danya and I worked together as attorneys, and Danya was in the courtroom. Tell us everything.
Oh, I don't know where to begin. Let's get out a thesaurus and go through as many adjectives as possible for bananas, bonkers, crazy town. I've been practicing law for half my life, which is a long time at this point, both federal and state, civil and criminal. I've never seen anything like this. I think I said in our last time together that the lawyers and all the participants left, the rules of civil procedure, of evidence, of decorum at the door when they walked into that courtroom. And it's one thing, everything's objectionable and everything is pure theater, but it got really very personal today and very unhinged. So we can get into, there was some substance. I guess we should talk about that. Very little, actually. And it happened pretty early on in the testimony. Pretty quickly, the AG's lawyer, Kevin Wallace, established, I think, everything he needed to, which is at the crux of the case for the Attorney General's office, which is that Mr. Trump had some involvement in these valuations and the statements of financial condition that are at the heart of the case. So pretty quickly, Mr. Trump gave that up readily. So he said, yes, he was aware of it. He was familiar with it. He had some input into it. And that kind of was really all that was needed.
Why? Explain that for everybody.
Yeah, the judge already ruled on summary judgment that these statements at issue were rife with fraud, that they overvalued many, many of these assets for the purpose of getting more favorable treatment with insurers and with banks for financing. So it really was just a question of establishing who's at fault, who is aware of this fraud. Now, it's true that there will be an appeal and that it is possible that ruling will, it's certain that the ruling will be scrutinized. It's within the realm of the possible that some or all of that ruling could be overturned. Seems highly, highly unlikely because at the end of the day, this is largely a paper case. And so really, I think what we're talking about in this trial is questions of punishment, of remedies, civil remedies, really, that include, disgorgement and what's known as the corporate death penalty, which really would put an end to the Trump organization. And so it was important for the AG's office to establish that Mr. Trump himself was aware of this. And as he said, he had input into it. He later distanced himself to some degree and put a lot of it as many, he's often been compared by my client, Michael Cohen, to a mafia boss. But, you see this a lot in that context where it's the underlings, it's the capos, it's the soldiers who are doing, the work. And here he tried to put a lot of it on his former CFO, Alan Weisselberg, and controller, Jeff McConney. I think it's Jeff, right? McConney. And also on his, very high end, he is stuck on the fact that his accountants were very expensive. So he put a lot on them. Exact. People mispronounce, Mazars or Mazars very differently. But at the end of the day, it's the high end, pricey accountants. And so he did some of that. But right out of the gates, he kind of put himself in it and established, because I think he had to some degree, because his name is all over those financial statements. And he does say in the financial statements that, he is the final decision maker here, and that he had final authority. But he got that came out pretty quickly. And then the rest of it was an exercise in blame, the blame game and pointing his finger both metaphorically and quite literally at the judge and the attorney general. There was a lot of like fake defenses that the judges already ruled were not effective, or that just simply as a matter of law, quite obviously are not.
Like what?
So, I mean, they're all over the place. Of course, there's the political witch hunt, a term he used quite a bit. He called the attorney general a political hack. He called the judge a fraud. And I think we should unpack that a little bit because it was pretty stunning. He goes on and on about how he actually undervalued these assets, that he's, richer than he even put on the paper, and how he understated the value of his, I think he referred to the properties as magical, or, they're artistic, or, whatever it is, but they're the best properties in the world. And his brand is the best in the world. He said at one point that he won the presidency because of his brand, which is maybe one of the few true statements that he made during the hours-long testimony. But, he went on and on about, let me see, I have my notes in front of me. I had a mediation right after testimony. And so I scrawled stuff down, but, I'm just getting home. And so, but there was a lot about materiality, how he didn't really care about the statements, and certainly the banks didn't care. The banks love him. They wanted to give him whatever he wanted.
He said the bankers are going to testify, right? And say that
he committed to that. And that they are going to say that they didn't really care about these statements
that they would have loaned him that amount of money no matter what.
Yes,
what does that do to
the case? Statute of limitations came up quite a bit, a thing that the judge has ruled on ad nauseum. And so, it was an opportunity every time he raised it or his attorneys objected based on it, and the judge would overrule the objection. He would get to smirk. There's a lot, the transcript will come out, but there's a lot that is not going to be on the four corners of the transcript, including a lot of like wild gesticulations and the smirking. And as I said, the actual finger pointing and the facial, gestures and expressions. So that, there was, he talks a lot. Sorry, this is kind of like a stream of consciousness now. Mm-hmm. In these statements of financial condition, there's something that it operates as a kind of a disclaimer. He likes to call it the worthless clause, which doesn't say, by my reading and by the judges, much more importantly, does not say what he says it says. What Mr. Trump repeatedly, again, ad nauseum, proclaims is that it essentially nullifies the entire financial statement. So there's one clause that says, the reader, essentially the bank, is free to do their own diligence. And so he repeatedly refers to this as the worthless clause. And at some point, the judge was a little erratic, but in my own opinion, but generally very polite and patient. At some point he said, let's move on. We're not going to do this again. But that didn't actually stop Mr. Trump from repeating that quote unquote defense. So that's a nutshell, but there's a lot of color in between, the lines there.
So there's 6 or 7 charges that he's charged with, right? One of them is this persistent fraud that the judge has already ruled on, and the remaining counts require that conduct to be intentional and that it to be material. If the banks get up and say, that didn't matter, we would have loaned him money anyway, what does that do to materiality? Does that matter, do you think?
It's a great question. So I think we can just dispense with the other piece of that you mentioned in passing, the intention part. I think that has been established. That's, again, these are just my opinions. Michael Cohen's testimony, I think, put intent to rest. And I do think Mr. Trump's testimony today was a nail in the coffin as well, because he didn't only say that he was a part of, all of this and he had input and both at times thought things were overvalued, at times thought they were undervalued. But he also, made clear that he views himself very much as, an expert in the field. And, there's probably not a lot of room for disagreement there, but he squarely says, look, no one knows real estate better than me. No one knows valuation better than me. No one knows banking better than me. And so between that and the other pieces of testimony that we just discussed, I think intent is probably going to be difficult for him on appeal. Materiality, I think, is very interesting. And I noted, as you just did, his promise and his lawyers promised that the banks would testify in a certain way. I'll be curious to see if that is borne out, because there's no question that the AG's lawyers have spoken with the banks and must be confident on this point. But it's certainly an element of some of these causes of action. And so it's hard to imagine a bank saying, yeah, we wanted this information. We reviewed this information carefully. We took notes on this information. We noted this in our paperwork in terms of what the financing was going to be, what the terms are going to be. All those things are true, but we didn't really care. It's hard. I just think that's going to be an uphill battle. But if the testimony comes in, as he and his lawyers predict, that could be a soft spot for the AG's office. So I'll be interested to see, maybe even sneak back into the courtroom to see what happens there.
It's just crazy. Can you imagine any one of us to say, oh yeah, my apartment's 3 times the size because I'm going to count the hallways and the elevators and the roof deck. And as a result, I'm going to take out, much more money than I could take out if I was honest about it. Right. Things like that. And then he uses that money to buy other things. And, that's how his wealth grows without playing fairly by the rules. Right. And at the same time, he doesn't pay as many taxes as the rest of us, because when it comes to tax purposes, these same properties that are worth lots and lots of money are worth a little bit of money. And, so he just doesn't play fairly. So to say this is victimless, which he keeps saying, I just think is wrong. It's not victimless. The rest of us are all the victims. We're the schmucks that pay too much tax, too much in taxes and don't get rich because we don't grift off of lies and fake money. Right. I mean, that's the offensive part of this.
Well, he does say there's a victim, but it's him. I mean, he's repeatedly saying not just that he's the subject of this political witch hunt, but that other real estate developers do this and get away with it, which obviously is not a legal defense. If you get a speeding ticket, you don't get to say, well, other people were going fast too. So even if that were true, and that's just not on trial here, that's a tough one too. But no, he definitely portrays himself very much as, poor me, and this is a political persecution. No doubt about it.
Speaking of somebody portraying themselves as poor me, I was shocked at Alina Habba, his lawyer, who gave a somewhat whiny press conference afterwards, saying how the judge yelled at me and was pounding his fists. And, I'm thinking to myself, okay, really? Your client just basically has been yelling at everybody, calling everybody names, and a judge was acting like a judge and trying to control his courtroom. I mean, did you see the judge yelling at her? And I mean,
I've heard her saying that the judge was yelling at her, but I didn't hear him yelling at her. It was interesting. I mean, a lot of this is for the media. A lot of this is for the audience of one, Trump himself. And some of it is probably for the appellate record. So a throwaway statement like that is blatantly untrue, is really just for, the first department, which is the appellate court, or ultimately the Court of Appeals. But yes, she also plays this, victim card quite a bit. And then on the other hand, she also, attempts to give tutorials in trial advocacy to the other side. So she's trying to tell Kevin Wallace how to ask a proper question, as she did with Michael Cohen. And let me tell you, it was not a masterclass from where I was sitting. So she does a lot of that. And she's very, very combative, of course, but also just for someone who, I don't know this for a fact, but from what I could tell, has never tried a case before. She's just amazingly supercilious and arrogant. So, that's just one of the parts of this that I found really shocking as a lawyer who, teaches professional responsibility and has taught trial advocacy. Just, the brazen, blatant disrespect for the court and for lawyers on the other side. I mean, the lawyers are just laughing to themselves, or, for the cameras or for the press. And it just, I get it's the judge has ruled and it's a bench trial. So there's no jury, to maintain decorum for. But still, it's almost hard to watch, as someone who cares about the practice. So yeah, that was another noteworthy tidbit from the day, or from all the proceedings, actually.
And so Don Jr. and Eric, who testified, basically took the tact of, we relied on the experts, wasn't me, I don't really know. I think Eric, when confronted with certain things, had to backtrack that a little bit. But they didn't fight the facts, right? They didn't say, oh, the numbers are wrong or right. I just didn't have anything to do with it. Mr. Trump today basically tried to embrace the facts and took responsibility. What does that do for Ivanka, who's going to be testifying later this week?
That's going to be one to watch too. I don't know. I mean, she's obviously out of the case. So she has been dismissed on statute of limitations grounds. So she obviously is in a very different position. She has separate counsel. I actually was with her attorney, and that matter had to run out too. But she's well represented, and she's just very differently positioned, and so it will be interesting. I don't know whether, they're still obviously very much in the tent, and playing the game together, but she's always been very careful. And, I'd be surprised if she outright perjures herself when she doesn't have exposure here. But I've stopped trying to predict how this long and windy road is going to twist and turn. So that might be another one I sneak back in the courtroom for.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. Now, did Mr. Trump's witnesses cross-examine him, or whatever you would call it at this stage? Because he was called by the Attorney General on direct.
So I was only there in the morning because I had to run out, but and I'm just, I haven't read anything about it. At least from what I could tell, it seemed very clear that they were not, quote unquote, cross-examining him as a friendly witness. That there was a lot of, posturing and talking about having to bring him back during the defense case. So no, they didn't. They made, long speeches, including talking about how brilliant he is and how he was not just the former president, but he's the future president. There was a lot of, playing to that crowd of one again, but they did not question him while I was there. And my strong sense was that that was not happening today.
And so Trump also was complaining that the judge was cutting him off and not letting him speak. And did you find that to be the case as well?
No, the judge didn't cut him off, but he did repeatedly admonish him to stop making speeches and to answer the question. And, Mr. Trump would ignore that and keep going. And so at some point, the judge then started turning to Chris Kise, his attorney, and trying to appeal to him, like, can you control your witness? Can you control your witness? And at some point threatened, if you can't, Mr. Kise, I'm going to have to do it for you. And he does have remedies to do that. He kind of tilted, at that and said, well, I could draw negative inferences. I could kick him off the stand and draw negative inferences, which, in lawyer speak just means, as means he could assume that the answer to any question that Mr. Wallace would have asked him was a bad one for the defense and a good one for the plaintiff in this case. So he didn't do that. and I would say, like, the judge even lost a little steam there, and in part because Mr. Wallace wasn't really objecting. I think he thought the answers were okay, despite the fact that they were meandering and non-responsive. There was some, I think, useful nuggets in them for the prosecution, for the plaintiff here. And so I think he just let it go on. So at some point, the judge said, look, Mr. Wallace, if you're not objecting and you're not moving to strike, then let's just move ahead. And so that's what happened. I think everyone just kind of threw up their hands.
And there goes what you were saying. The rules of evidence just do not apply in this courtroom. It's a free for all.
Free for all. I was just going to say it was absolute mayhem. Yeah.
Well, was it crowded? Were there a lot of people there?
Yeah, it was packed. I was allowed in because, I had represented Mr. Cohen, but standing room only. I don't know. It's the huge ceremonial courtroom. It's just an absolutely beautiful courtroom. I had probably 100 people. I'm not good at estimating, but packed house, and really riveting. And you could hear every time. It was mostly quiet. People were listening, but then every time Mr. Trump said something outrageous, including calling the court a fraud, and saying that he said he was either, called him a couple times a fraud. And then he said, well, you're either a fraud or very stupid.
He said that?
A lot of that. Yeah. I'm not a stenographer, so I didn't take notes, but he said that, the people here, so it could have been the AG's office, but in context, I think it was the judge, are either very stupid or committing a fraud here. And, at those moments, you could hear just all of the clicking on people's computers. And so even if you didn't understand English, for example, and you just heard, the clicking away, you would know, wow, something pretty explosive just happened. It was almost comical.
Can you imagine, like, talking to a court like that? I mean, he's the former president of the United States. Like,
future, according to his lawyers.
Well, God,
I know, we saw the polling today.
I know, exactly.
No, it really does feel like he is a caricature of himself. And I don't even think I'm being disrespectful by saying this. I think he almost means it. At times I think it was calculated. He took the judge to task quite a few times for grossly undervaluing Mar-a-Lago. That was the theme. He had a couple of themes that he kept hitting. And, he says Mar-a-Lago is worth between $1 billion and $1.5 billion. The judge, said something in his ruling, which the judge made a dig at Mr. Trump and said, I don't think you've read my ruling, which seems apt. But he said something about it being assessed at $18 million, which Mr. Trump takes great issue with. And
I wonder how he's going to feel. How's he going to feel when the tax assessor of Palm Beach County comes and says,
"Oh, $1.5 billion? Well, that's interesting." Yeah. But at one point, he said something like, a quarter of a tennis court is worth $18 million. So there's at another point, he was talking about when he was being asked about the valuation of Mar-a-Lago, and how, he's assuming that it could be developed, right, as residences or something. And then he was shown a document where he promised in perpetuity that he would not develop it. And he said something, well, that's more bravado than a statement of legal intention. So that, he's kind of in some way very self-aware that a lot of the shtick is bravado. And so that's why I'm saying I try not to be disrespectful. I try and, call it like I see it. And I think he was very intentionally, being blustery and engaging in that kind of bravado. I will say, I also, again, just in my own opinion, did seem at times to be out of control, like not, undisciplined. Like, I don't think that, it would not be good strategy, in my view, to use some of the language that he did. And in the same way that he had moments, when Mr. Cohen testified, at one point he stormed out of the room, slammed, pounded his fist on the table and left the room. I have to believe that was an unscripted moment. And I think there were some of those today, but I'm certainly not doing any kind of psychological profile of him and don't pretend to know, where that line is. But that's just my view as a court observer.
Yeah. Well, how scary though for all of us that somebody who could be the president of the United States with his finger on the nuclear button has so little discipline and self-control, right? That he can't. I mean, this is a judge trial without a jury, and he can't even control his emotions here. I mean, it's scary, right? I mean,
yeah. And it felt very, he was talking about the judge, and it was funny. He's facing straight ahead. The judge is right next to him, and they're kind of making faces a little bit at each other, mostly Mr. Trump doing the face making, and he's excoriating the judge, saying, "You're a fraud. This is a disgrace. Everyone should be ashamed of themselves." But he's looking straight ahead. It really felt like theater. And at one point he said, he's talking about the judge, but really to the judge. He's saying, "He called me a fraud and he doesn't even know me." It felt like a tantrum. It felt like a crazy thing to say. That's not how the legal and judicial process works. So I need to get to know him. The judge is looking at the facts and deciding the law. So it's not personal like that, but he certainly felt it to be. And that did feel like one of those moments where he's really acting out and was not able to, conduct himself. It's certainly not in a court appropriate way, but even in a way that strategically would make any sense, both with this court and with any court of appeals.
Yeah. And it sounds like he's, I hate to use this word, because I think it's an overused word, but he sounds almost like a coward that he couldn't look the judge in the eye and say these things, right? That he had to look straight ahead and say it to the room.
Yeah, that has been said about him. Certainly Michael Cohen, or my client, has said this publicly, that he actually doesn't like direct confrontation. And it's hard to square that with, the persona that we see sometimes. I think that's one fair read of it, that it was, he's just kind of externalizing a lot of the clear stress that he feels and the injustice. But it was, for the audience of the press and for, his base or whatever it was. And he was afraid to kind of turn and look the judge in the eye. So, it seemed like a telling moment.
Wow. Anything else before we sign off that you want to add?
I want to scour my notes for a second, because there were just so many little nuggets, some of which were at odds, with each other. He would talk about how he was proud of these statements of financial condition. That those are not exactly his words, but he put a lot of money into them and wanted them to be good, and they're better than other developers. But in the next breath, he would say, "I didn't really care about them at all. They don't matter at all." So it seemed like there was not always a coherent thread running through it. And there really was a lot of bluster. He would say, that the fraud is being perpetrated on him, Mr. Trump. And he just repeatedly would say, this is the opposite of a fraud, what he's accused of, whatever the opposite of a fraud is. Don't know. But he really feels, I think he feels, or certainly repeatedly proclaims, that, again, he's the victim of all this. And he feels the need to tell the court, the world, that he's actually the finest real estate magnate, the most, has the most financial acumen, is richer than everyone even believes. It is that, that persona that we've seen on TV for so long, coming to life in the courtroom in a context that really does matter, that really has the potential to be ruinous for him and his business, which, is his brand and is something he cares very, very deeply about, which came out in full force today.
Yeah, well, his constant need for validation, certainly, anyone who lives in New York, or every building that he owns has Trump Tower, Trump, he has to put his name everywhere. I drive down the highway. It's like this portion of the highway was cleaned by, the picked up litter sponsored by Trump, like he has to, the Trump park, he just has to have his name on everything. Right. And it's at a certain point, it just feels like this insecurity, that he just needs this, constant validation. He talks at people. He loves big crowds. I mean, I don't know. I'm not who can psychoanalyze anyone, but it's just crazy. Everything you see, it just seems like that, right? It's so interesting.
He did it again. It was a moment, I think, of truth telling. He said, his brand bought him the presidency, and there's certainly some truth to that. And he certainly, from his remarks today, thinks that's going to work for him again. So whatever this.
While he was on the stand, his campaign was fundraising off of it. Literally sent out a fundraising plea for money saying, I'm being railroaded, this and that, donate money, donate money, donate money. If he's so rich and successful, why does he take everyone's money? Why is he constantly grifting off of these legal cases, right? Like he should be able to pay for it himself if he's so rich.
It seems like he doesn't need to. He did talk today again about his wealth and how it's, it's been undervalued and how no one understands how rich he is, that kind of thing. So that's definitely a sore point for him. There's no question. And he's got all these criminal cases swirling around him. This one does seem to hit a real, really hit home with him. And I think it's, to your point, that's the core, if there is a core. And I'm sorry, that is a little disrespectful, but that is at the center of at least what he projects to the world.
Thank you, Danya, for joining again. It's always great to see you. And this is a special edition of Legal AF live, straight from hot off the press. Danya Perry, who was in the courtroom today, watching it all happen. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Karen.
Hey, Meidas Mighty. Love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.